This is your complete crash course for Next.js 13 app router, the latest version of Next.js. And more specifically, I'm going to focus on 3 core fundamentals of Next.js that I think are very important for you to understand to get started with building your Next.js applications. Now, I'm not going to go over every single little thing in this crash course, hence crash course. And I do have a 6-hour course on Next.js if you want to go more in depth on really everything that I think that you need to know regarding Next.js. But for this course, I'm going to show you some examples with just kind of a demonstration project within VS Code. And I would say that for Next.js, it's important to understand JavaScript as well as React before learning Next.js, as Next.js is just a React framework. It is a full stack React framework. So effectively, React, it is a JavaScript library that helps you build user interfaces. And Next.js uses React, so you still have that React to build those user interfaces, but Next.js also gives you the ability to make requests on the server, and it has built-in ways to do route handlers as well as file-based routing, and Next.js provides different structures around React.js, a little bit more opinionated structures that might help you build full stack web applications. And I personally really like Next.js. Now, we're going to focus on 3 fundamentals. One is that Next.js has a built-in file-based routing system, and there's actually quite a bit to know about Next.js routing. Number 2, we're going to focus on how Next.js in the latest version, it thinks server first. So Next.js introduced server components. We're going to discuss what those are, when you might use those compared to client components, and different implications of that. And then we're going to end with how Next.js has a built-in route handlers. So if you need to handle GET requests, POST requests, different things like that within your application, handle those on the server, how can you do those in Next.js? And I think if you understand these 3 core fundamentals, you'll definitely be able to get started working with Next.js. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to head to VS Code, and I'm going to create a new Next.js project. So I'm going to do npx, and this is within my terminal, create-next-app, @, and then latest. And then it's going to give me some different prompts here. So what is my project name? I'm just going to do crash course. I'm not going to use TypeScript for this. No ESLint. I mean, I could use Tailwind. I guess I'll use Tailwind. And I'm not going to use an SRC directory. I am going to use the app router. And I am not going to customize the default import alias. And a quick note while this is loading up, in Next.js, it's pretty unopinionated how you do your styling. You can use CSS modules. You can use Tailwind CSS. You can just use normal CSS. There's a lot of different things that you can do. You can use styled components. So whatever styling that you're used to, I'm sure you can probably do it in Next.js. But now that I have this project ready to go here, I'm going to go up to my file system. I'm going to click open, and then I'm going to open this project within VS Code. So now that I have this project open, what I can do is within my terminal, I can do npm run dev, and it says that it is ready and it has started on localhost 3000. So if I go to my browser, I am currently at localhost 3000 here. If I refresh my web page here, you should see just this template Next.js application. So now let's go over to VS Code, and the first thing that we're going to discuss is the file-based router. So you're going to see that within my project here, it added a bunch of different things. So it added kind of a CSS config, my package.json, a Next.js config. It added a public folder with some different assets in there. Of course, you have your node modules, and then also we have this app folder. And that is where most of your logic is going to be in for your Next.js application within this app folder. So I'm going to open this up, and you're going to see this app folder has a few different things. It has a layout file as well as a page file and global CSS, and then just a favicon. So here we have a page.js, and this is not just some unopinionated file name. In Next.js, the way that you create a new route is you create a folder and you put a page.js file within that folder. So the root of your application, this is going to represent just /. So localhost 3000, that is the root of my application. If I had some other domain name, say crashcourse.com, crashcourse.com is the root of my application that corresponds to just my app folder. So my root page here that I'm going to show is going to be page.jsx. And what you can see here is that within this file, we can see we have this learn about Next.js with an interactive course. And we can see on this page, learn about Next.js in an interactive course. And I can edit this. I can change this to React.js, click save. You can see that this now changes this to React.js down here. So within my app folder, since I don't have any nested folders within this folder, this page.js file, this creates a new route at my root folder here, or at the root of my application. And this is what's going to show when I'm just at my root URL. But how can I now create different routes? Well, within my app folder, I can just create another folder and I can just give this a name. So I'm going to just do like an about page. So I'm going to do about. And then within my about folder, if I create a new page dot, it could be JS, TS, TSX, JSX. If I create a new page.jsx file within my about folder, that creates a new public route. And this route is going to be at /about. So my app page.js file is just going to be /. It's going to be my root URL. But when I went to create other routes within my application, I create a folder, but then you have to put a page.js file within that folder, and that creates a public route. And it's going to correspond to the name of your folder. So at /about, I'm going to show the user whatever I return in my page.jsx file. So here, I'm going to just create a React component, export default function about page. And then all I'm going to do here is I will return, maybe I'll return a main tag, and I'll do an h1 tag about page. And then I'll do a p tag, and then I'll just do some lorem ipsum text. And I used emit abbreviations and just typed lorem and pressed return to do that. So if I go back to my application here and I go to /about, what you're going to see is I now see my about page. I see my lorem ipsum text and my about page header. And that's because within my file system here, within my app folder, I created another folder about, and I created a page.jsx file within this about folder. But if I name this folder, let's say about -me, and I save this, and then I come back, you see I get a 404 page. That page doesn't exist. That route doesn't exist. I would have to go to about me, and then it does show. Okay, so that is how you create just a basic route in Next.js. And I'm going to change this back to just about. But now that we know how to create just a basic route in Next.js, how do we actually create nested routes? So like, what if I wanted to do like a blog page, and then I wanted to show a settings page within my blog page? Well, I can create a new folder, and I could do blog. And then within my blog page, I could do another page.jsx file. So I just created a new route at /blog. And then I'm just going to return, I'm going to copy my about page. I'm going to go to my blog page. I'm going to rename this to blog page. And I'm going to keep that just one word. I'm going to copy that. Actually, I'm just going to do blog page. So now if I go to, /about, we see my about page. And then if I go to /blog, we now see my blog page. But now what if I want to go to /blog/settings? Well, we do a very similar thing. We follow the same structure. So within my blog folder, I created another folder, and I'll call this settings. And then within my settings folder, within my blog folder, I can create another page.jsx file within that. And then here for my settings page, I'll export a default function, and I'll just call this blog settings. And then I will return a main tag here. We'll have h1, we'll do blog settings, and then we'll do a paragraph. These are my blog settings. And then I'll do another paragraph and I'll say, isn't my blog beautiful? And so on and so forth. So now if I go to /blog/settings, you're going to see I get an error because I went to /setting. I didn't go to /settings. So if I add an S there and I do this correctly, I now see my blog settings. These are my blog settings. Isn't my blog beautiful? And I do realize at this point that I did spell beautiful, which, is what it is. So that's how you can create nested routes. But what if you want to create a dynamic route? Let's say I have a blog and I want to go to my blog with the ID of, number 1. How could I do that? Well, I might want to go to /1 to go to my blog number 1 to view that. So how could we implement something like this? That's a dynamic route. And then if I went to blog number 2, it shows my second blog. And if I went to blog number 3, it shows my third blog. Well, the way that we can do this is within my blog folder, I can add another folder. But the way that we can add a dynamic route is using square bracket syntax. So we can do left square bracket, and then I'm just going to put in ID here. I'll show you the significance of this name here in a second, and then close this square bracket. So using the square brackets, this makes this a dynamic route. So if I go to blog / and then any dynamic variable, anything other than settings, it is then going to go to this page, or it's going to route to the page.jsx file that I put within this square bracket ID square bracket folder. So I have my page.jsx, and then I'm going to export default function, and I'm just going to say blog post. And then I'm going to return in h1 blog number, and then we'll fill in the number here in just a second, and I'm going to actually wrap this in the main tag as well. And I'm going to cut that, paste it here, and then we'll just do another paragraph of some lorem ipsum text here. And I also would recommend using prettier, but I didn't want to set that up for this crash course. So now if I go to blog /1, I should see this page right here. So let's go ahead, let's go back, and we do see this. So I go blog /3, I see this page, /2, this page, /1, this page. But you can see that this page isn't really dynamic. How can I actually use this param right here? Well, in Next.js, it's automatically going to pass you on the props object that you get from React. It's going to pass you a params property. And that params property is going to hold the value of this dynamic parameter. So here, I can accept my props, and then I can say const params is equal to props.params, and then let's just console.log my params. Now, this is a server component, so it's actually going to show within Node.js here, and you can see when I console log this to my terminal here, I get params, and then my params points to an object where I have ID of number 1. So you can see I can access my URL parameters here with using my props.params, and you can see it's .id. But if I change this to, let's change it to, I don't know, dynamic blog or something like that, you're going to see that my params changes to dynamic blog. So whatever dynamic name I use here, it's going to be accessible on my params object. So params.id, params.dynamicblog, params.slug, something like that. I'm going to change it back to ID. So hopefully that makes sense there. So here I can do ID, and then you can see it switches to ID here because I'm console logging my params. But now if I close this, well, I can actually do this a bit differently. I can just destructure params automatically here. And then I can say const ID is equal to params dot ID. And then if I want to render out my ID, I can say blog number and then render out my ID. I'll get rid of that console log. So now if I come back, I see that since I'm at my parameter of blog/1, I'm at blog number 1. And if I go to blog/2, you can see I'm at blog number 2. Blog/3, I'm at blog number 3. So this is how you can use dynamic routes in order to show a dynamic page based on a certain route. So, you could imagine that once I get this param number 3 here, I can make a request to my database to get my blog number 3 based on that ID and show my blog number 3. So that is how you can create dynamic routes within your applications. But how can you navigate between pages? Like, I've shown you how to create your basic routes, your nested routes, as well as dynamic routes. But how can you navigate between your different pages? Well, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. The first way is by using a Next.js link component. So Next.js gives you a component out of the box that is a link component. It works very similarly to how a tag works in regular HTML. So what I can do here is I can render out link, and I'm going to import that from next/link. Okay. And then I'm going to say, go to home page. But for this link, all I need to do to add this link is give it an href. So I'm going to do href is equal to, and I'll pass in a relative path to my home page. So I'm going to go to just /. So now if I come back here, I see I have this link that's go to homepage, and I click on it, and it navigates me to just localhost 3000, my home page. But what if I wanted to navigate to my about page? Well, in my home page here, let me just add a link just kind of randomly within this page. Let's just go ahead and add it right here. So let's add a link. And I automatically imported that from next link. And then let's say go to about page. And then I need to add an href. And then this is going to be /about. And then if I come back, let's see, go to about page. I click on it. It goes to my about page. So that is how you can use links in Next.js. But how could you implement programmatic linking? Well, you could also use Next navigation or the router within Next.js. So let's go to our about page and let's do this here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a button in which when they click on this button, I'm going to navigate them to the home page. So I'm going to just do a button. And then I'm going to say go to home page. And then on click, I'm going to pass in a function saying navigate to home. And then in the body of my about page component, I'm going to create a function saying navigate to home. And all it's going to do is it is going to use the Next.js router, and it's going to push the user to the home page. But to use the router, we first need to import it. So I'm going to say const router is equal to use router. and we're going to import that from next/navigation. So I've imported that here, and I'm calling this useRouter function, and it's going to return a router. And then for this router, I'm going to be able to do router.push, and then I'm going to push them to a certain URL. So this is just pushing them to my home page here. And then /about would be pushing to my about page. But here we want to navigate to home. Now, you're going to notice one issue with doing this, which is going to lead me right into my next principle about how Next.js thinks about being server first. So I'm going to come back here. There's going to be an error. Then what you're going to see is useRouter only works in client components. Add the use client directive at the top of the file to use it. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to my next fundamental about how Next.js is server first. So let's come back here. And what we need to do is make this a client component. And then the way that we do this is by adding a string called useClient at the top of this page. And now that we have this makes this entire page a client component. So let's come back and we can see everything works. I have my go to homepage button here, as you can see here. And, maybe let's make it more clear. So I'm going to add border is 1 pixel solid white. And you can see this is my button here. So I'm going to click on this and it pushes me to my home page. So here I use my link to go to my about page. And here I use my router to push me to my home page. And you can see I can use links. I can use those in server components. And I can use my router and programmatically push a user on click only in client components. And one reason for that is because the user clicks on this in my client, in the browser. So this is running in the browser right now. So it has to be a client component to be able to handle this user interaction here. So anytime you use user interactions, it needs to be a client component. Okay. But those are the two ways that you can navigate between your pages. So that covers fundamental number one. Next.js is a built-in file-based routing system where you can do nested routes, dynamic routes, linking, navigation, all that stuff. But now let's move to how Next.js thinks about things in server first. And you saw a little bit of a taste of it there. So what do I mean that Next.js thinks about things server first? Well, with the latest app router and server components, everything in Next.js, or every component in Next.js, is now by default a server rendered component, meaning it's rendered on the server and then sent to the browser, which is different than what it used to be, to where components in React used to be client components, meaning you would send them to the client and the rendering would take place on the client, which does have some implications to where if you need to handle user interactions, so clicking a button, typing in an input, using state in React, using reducers in React, using context in React, all those components are going to have to be client components. And you are going to have to explicitly say that those are client components, just like what we had to do earlier, to where to make something a client component in Next.js, you need to use the use client string, or use client directive is the fancy term for it, at the top of the file. And this is going to make this a client component, meaning it's going to be rendered by the browser. It's not going to be rendered by the server. So let me show you another example of this. Let's go to, maybe we'll just go to our blog page. And let's say that within my blog page, I want to just use some different state here. Let's go ahead and just create like a basic little counter. So I'm going to just say const count, comma, set count is equal to use state, and let's initialize it to 0. So here we have a count of 0, and then let's just do below my h1, let's render out in h2 that says count, and then render out my count. And then if I go to /blog, what you're going to see here is I'm going to get an error because, well, for one, use state is not defined. So let's go ahead and define use state. So we need to import use state from React. So now if I come back, I now see that you're importing a component that needs use state. It will only work in client components. So what we need to go ahead and do is we need to go ahead and use the use client directive here to make this a client component. And now that we have this in place, we can actually see our count of 0. And then if we wanted to go ahead and, make some sort of counter, we do function saying, I don't know, count handler, in which we will just go ahead and we'll increase the count here. So we're going to set the count. We're going to take the previous count and just do count plus 1. And let's go ahead and do a button that says increment. And then the onClick is going to be count handler. So if we go ahead and come back here, if I didn't mess up my logic, we can see we now have a counter that increments, and you could implement decrement and stuff like that. But the purpose of showing you this is if I want to have this interactive state here, it needs to be a client component. And in the latest Next.js, it thinks server first. Now, there are some important considerations of this when it comes to using external JavaScript libraries, as a lot of JavaScript libraries expect you to be in a browser environment. But if you're using server components, you're in a server environment. You're not in the web browser. So some of those packages that you use might actually not work. And there's still some kinks to be worked out with this, as, a lot of people, when they use Next.js, they're still kind of thinking in that client-focused way rather than a server-focused way. So that is just something to keep in mind. If you don't put use client at the top of your file, it's going to be rendered on the server, not in a browser environment. Now, another important consideration here is that Next.js recommends that you keep things server rendered whenever possible. And this is for the purposes of improving performance, as if you pre-render stuff on the server and then just serve that to the client, you can potentially increase your performance by doing so. Now, when you use the use client directive, you make that entire page a client component, which is not necessarily what you always want to do. And a better way to go about things would be to open up kind of holes in your application that you can fill in with client components. And this is something that Astro kind of does as well. It's another kind of framework or library for React in which it has client islands. So very similar thing here with client components. So rather than making this entire blog page a client component, what we could actually do is we could create a counter component that is a client component. We can move all of our client logic into that component and then just kind of fill in a client island here with that component. So I'm going to create another folder called components, and I'm not going to add a page.jsx file within this folder. So it's not going to add a /components route because I'm not adding a page.jsx file within this components folder. But I am going to add a counter.jsx component. And what I'm going to do here is, let me see this about page. I'm going to copy this entire page and then I'm going to paste it into my counter component. But we're just going to name this counter. And all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to return an H2 with the count as well as the button here. So I'm going to change this to be, I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to also remove my lorem ipsum text here. And then I'm also just going to render out a React fragment here instead of a main tag. But now everything else looks good. So I still have my counter set count. It's a client component, and we should be good here. But now within my blog page, instead of making this entire page a client component, I'm just going to render out my client component within this server components, because you can render client components within server components. All right, so I'm going to do my counter right here. I'm going to import that from components /counter, and I'm going to render that out within here. So I'm going to remove all of my stateful logic here, and then I'm going to remove use client as well as use state. So now I'm using my counter within my blog page. So I know this is a bit of a small, somewhat contrived example, But you could imagine if you had a page here that had a ton of different logic, and maybe you're making a request to your server and you're doing that from your server. So like you want to do that on your server and you have a bunch of different stuff that's server rendered. Well, you don't want to just go and make this entire page a client page if you can get around it. Rather, it would be better to take that client logic, wrap that up into a React component, and then just render that client component as kind of a slot or kind of filling in a hole of your server component here. So now I'm rendering out my client component here within my server component, and within my blog page, you can see everything still works here. I still can increment this. I can still have this kind of client rendered benefits here within my server component, which is really cool. You kind of can get the best of both worlds when it comes to server and client components within Next.js here. So that is one big fundamental to keep in mind, that Next.js thinks about things in a server-first manner. And when you want to use kind of client-side logic, so using state, using useState, useReducer, useEffect, using browser packages that use the browser and expect things to be rendered in the browser, all of that can be done within a client component. You use the useClient string at the top of the file, but just keep in mind that you don't usually want to make an entire page a client component. You just kind of want to slot in your client components within your server rendered application. So Next.js is server first, definitely a fundamental to keep in mind. But now let's move on to our last fundamental here about how Next.js, it has file-based route handlers. And we're also going to discuss, do you always need to use route handlers, or with server components, can you get away with not using them as much, which I think you can. So as you can see in the Next.js docs here, route handlers allow you to create custom request handlers for a given route using request and response APIs. So they show you here, you can use an API folder and create a route.js file within that folder. So if you make a request to /API, you can handle that request within that folder. And you can do that by exporting an async function called get, and then handling the request there. And you can use a bunch of different methods here. You can use post requests, put requests, most of the different requests that you can use with standard HTTP methods. So here you can see an example here. They have a /items /route.ts file in which they handle a GET request, in which they can then make a request to their database here, and then they can return a response with the data that they got from their database here. So this is a good way to handle your different requests within Next.js. Now, let's kind of show you how this can be done. So here, I'm going to make a new folder called API. So I'm going to go API, and then within my API folder, the way that I can create a route handler is by creating a route.js file within a certain folder. So if I created a route.js file within my about folder and I made a request to /about, well, that would be the route handler for that request. I would add it to my about page. But here, since I added a route.js file to this API folder, it adds a route handler to /API. Okay, so let me come back. I'm going to actually just copy this right here and let me paste it into this route folder. So I'm exporting an async function get. If I wanted to handle a post request, it would be export async function post, so on and so forth for the other methods. But here, I'm not going to make another fetch request to this URL because, quite frankly, I don't have a MongoDB database set up. But let's just use like a different URL or a different place where we can go get data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use JSON placeholder. So here I'm at jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. This is just a place to where you can go to get different data. So here we can fetch a resource at JSON placeholder.typeofcode.com/post/1. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to take this right here, copy this URL, and paste this within my fetch method. So right here, and I'm going to clean this up just a bit. So now when I make a request to /API and it's a GET request, then this handler is going to get triggered here. And I'm going to have this fetch request that is made to this URL endpoint, and I'm going to return a response with this data returned from this endpoint. And you can imagine that this could be, an endpoint that is my own database, and I could get data from my database and handle it within this route handler here. So this is how you can build like a built-in API and interface to interact with your database right within Next.js. So let's go ahead and let me go to a client component here. So I think my about page is a client component. Let's go ahead and make a fetch request to this API endpoint. So within my client component, what I can do here is I can do use effect, and then I can just call this on mount. And what I can do is I can say, I'm going to make this an async function. And I'm going to say const res equals await, and I'm going to fetch /API. So this is going to make a GET request to /API. And then all I want to do right now is I'm going to console.log the response that is made. So let's go ahead and come back to my application here. Let's open my console. I'm going to clear it. And then let's go to I believe it was my about page. And I actually just made a error here. So instead of passing in an async function right here, that's not going to actually work because it returns a promise, and that's not allowed within use effect. That's an oversight that I do sometimes forget, but I'm going to just go ahead and do fetch API, and then I'm going to say .then, and I'm going to get my response, and I'll just console.log my response like that. So I'm going to remove this, and I'll remove this. So now let's come back. Let's clear all those errors in the console. Let's refresh. And I do indeed get a response here. And we can see that I have a response body. It's a readable string. So there's one less thing that we need to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and do fetch /API. And then I get my response. I convert that to JSON. And then I get my data and console log my data here. So let me clear this. Let me refresh. And I see my data. And then you can see that it does have a body, it has a title, it has a user ID. So it is returning this blog post that I'm returning from my JSON placeholder. So I'm making a GET request to /API, which is getting this post from this kind of database here, this kind of free database. And you can imagine this could be my own database that I use. And if I change this to post number 2, what you're going to see is if I refresh now and I open it up, you can see I now have ID number 2 because I'm now getting my second post. So it is indeed working. I am indeed getting my post here. Now, what if I wanted to use my request somewhere within this GET function? Well, here it automatically gives you the request. So let's just console log the request here. So let's do that. Let's refresh. We're not going to see it in this console because this is going to run on our server. This is a Node API. So here we can see I console log my request here, which is a next request. So it has the body, the window. It should have the method in here somewhere, which is get, and you could use your request. And then if you needed to use like request parameters, so let's go ahead and then you can see within the Next.js documentation here that you can use like dynamic route segments in which you can get the request as the first argument of your GET request. And then you can use a params as the second argument. So if you access API /items/ some dynamic route and you put a route.js file within that dynamic route, then it would be if you went to items /a, so your dynamic slug is a, then your param is going to be slug a. So that is how you could use dynamic routes. And then if you wanted to use URL query parameters, you can use search params is request.nexturl.search params. And then you could use const query is search params.get and then one query. So if you query for API/search ? And you put a query param of hello, then this would return, you would get the query parameter of query, and that would return the value of hello. So that's also how you can use different query parameters and dynamic routes within your different route handlers here. Here you can see for a post request, it does a very similar thing in which you can accept that request, and then you can get the messages by doing a request.json and using it that way. And you can handle cores and do a bunch of different things to where, hopefully this gives you the gist of how route handlers works for this crash course. But, if there's anything that you're looking for using cookies, using headers, it's all really spelled out in the documentation and it's all fairly straightforward to use. So that's how you can use route handlers. But that brings me to the question, do you actually really need to use route handlers? Well, sometimes you might need to, but often you can kind of get away with not needing to use them. So within my about page, I make this a client component, and then I make this fetch request to my own endpoint that gets this data, which that's fine. If this needed to be a client component, that might be what I need to do there to be able to access my database in a safe way using my own API. But what if this was a server component? So let's get rid of this button here. And let's go ahead and get rid of use client here. Let's get rid of my router. Let's get rid of this. And let's also get rid of this use effect and this right here. So this is now just a normal server component. Well, would I really need to make a fetch request to my own endpoint here? Or since this is already a server component, can't I just automatically make a request to my database? Yes, you can 100% do that. And I would generally recommend that's what you should do is if you're using a server component, make your fetch request from your server components whenever possible. And then you don't need to set up your route handlers. I can just make a direct request to an API endpoint from my server component. So here, let me just go ahead and I'm going to get this data right here. I'm going to come back to my about page and let me just create a function above in which I'm going to do async function get post. And I'm going to paste those lines of codes here in which I'm going to do const res is I can make a server fetch request to this endpoint, potentially an endpoint for my database. And then I can say my data is my res.json, and then I can just return my data. And then to use this, I can make this an async function here. And then in the body of my function, I can just say const data is equal to await, and then I can call get post. And then I can get my data like so. And then I can just console log my data here to make sure that this is indeed working. So now let's go to my about page and see if this is indeed working. So I'm going to clear this. I'm going to re-render. You see, I don't see anything in my console here, but that's because this is now a server component. So let's come back. Let's open up my terminal and we can see that I have my data right here as a title, a body, so on and so forth. So if I want to use this data within my component, I can just say that now my title is actually just going to be data.title. And then my paragraph tag here, let's just go ahead and make this. I believe it was data.body. So I can make this data.body. And then if we render this out, we can see I now have this title that is different because that's what's returned from my JSON placeholder here. And if I change this to post number 1, what you're going to see is now I have a new title here because now it's getting a different post. So within your server components, you can make your fetch request directly to a database just right away in these server components. You don't necessarily need to create a route handler to do that. But if it's a client component and you need to have that API layer in between your client component and your database, Of course, that's where you can use your route handlers, and you could just make a request to your / API and use your request and handle it like we did here. But often you might not need to do this. And, you can imagine that like if this was a dynamic page, well, let's actually just go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and I'm going to go to my blog and my dynamic route here. Let's go to this page.jsx and let's go ahead. Let's use our get post function. But now I'm going to pass it an ID here. And then within this fetch URL, let's go ahead and pass in $ curly brace. Let's do an ID here. And then since I already have my ID from my dynamic route here, let's go ahead and just say const data is equal to await. And let's make this an async function. And then I'm going to get my post, pass in my ID. So now based on my dynamic route here, I'm getting my dynamic post because I'm passing in my ID, which is my param right here in my dynamic parameters here within my dynamic route. And I'm requesting to that dynamic ID. So it should return a dynamic post for me. So here I can do the same thing. I can just do data.title. And let's just do the title here so you can see this working. So let's go ahead and let's go to /blog/1. So this gets my first blog post title. But now if I go to /2, you see it goes to my second blog post title. And 3, it goes to my third. So you can see how you can combine dynamic routes and use your parameters from those routes to then make a request to your database or to some other API to get dynamic posts or dynamic data based on those dynamic routes, which is pretty cool. And this can all be done within your server components because this is all done on the server. I wouldn't need to worry like if I had certain credentials and things like that, I can all do this on the server. I wouldn't have to have that API layer because I can make these requests from these server components. So that, my friends, is a complete crash course on Next.js. I think if you understand the fundamentals that I just went over, you are, way on track to be able to build your own Next.js application. So thanks for tuning into this. Hopefully this helps. I'm losing my voice a little bit, so I'd appreciate, a comment, a like, a subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. But with that, I will see you in that next one.